Thanks very much, Anna. Good evening, everybody. Thanks very much for coming out this evening. It's always good to be back in Amsterdam. Before I get down to the main business of the evening, I'd just like to thank all the people involved in organising tonight's event, especially Sonia, who's done an absolutely fantastic job. My friends, a few months ago, I visited the birthplace of Arthur James Balfour in Scotland. And next to his family's old home, there is a little church with a plaque dedicated to Balfour on its rear wall. That plaque celebrates Balfour as a man who advanced truth, righteousness, and peace in the world. Needless to say, that rosy tribute is at complete variance with the legacy of dispossession that Balfour bequeathed to Palestine. As Britain's foreign minister, Balfour signed a pledge to support the Zionist movement's key objective on the 2nd of November 1917, so exactly 100 years ago today. The Balfour Declaration, as that pledge became known, was phrased awkwardly and ambiguously, yet its real intent could not be hidden. Through that document, Britain became the sponsor of a Jewish state that would be established in Palestine by expelling its indigenous people en masse. The assurances in the Balfour Declaration about avoiding harm to the Palestinians ultimately proved meaningless. As Balfour himself would later insist, so just a couple of years after his declaration, Britain regarded Zionist aspirations to be more important than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. The colonization of Palestine was something of an anomaly in this period. Endorsed by Woodrow Wilson, the American president, the whole concept of self-determination for colonized peoples was becoming more popular. Chaim Weizmann, a scientist based in Manchester and a leading figure in the Zionist movement, lobbied for the principle to be rejected in the case of Palestine. Weizmann's efforts, unfortunately, were successful. As a result, the League of Nations mandate, under which Britain ruled Palestine between the two world wars, contained an explicit commitment to nurture Zionist colonization. Not sure what I knocked out over there. Sorry about that. Okay. Will I put it here? Is that easier? Then I won't knock it again. Okay. The Balfour Declaration was in effect copied and pasted into that mandate, into the mandate under which Britain ruled Palestine between the two world wars. Before long, Britain's support for Zionism had a visible impact. Herbert Samuel became the first British High Commissioner for Palestine in 1920. Herbert Samuel was himself a staunch Zionist, and he introduced a series of measures designed to facilitate and finance the taking over by European settlers of land on which Palestinians had lived and farmed for many generations. Entire villages were bought up by colonizers in the Galilee region. And when the people actually living in those villages refused to move, their complaints were overruled by Herbert Samuel's administration. Large-scale evictions thereby received the green light from the British authorities. Understandably, many Palestinians resisted the evictions and the discrimination which they encountered. Britain responded to that resistance in a frequently brutal manner. Faced with unrest in the early 1920s, a man called Winston Churchill, who was then Britain's colonial secretary, recommended that a picked force of white gendarmerie should be formed and dispatched to Palestine. This would be comprised of men who had previously served with Britain's forces in Ireland during Ireland's War of Independence. Now, learning that those forces had in effect been sent from Ireland to Palestine was something that both disturbed and fascinated me. I grew up in a town north of Dublin that was largely burned down by British forces in September 1920. During that same month, September 1920, my great-granduncle was shot dead by British forces in another part of Ireland. My great-granduncle, his name was Patrick Hartnett. He was a postman in County Limerick, and he had no known involvement in the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. He was doing nothing more sinister than walking along a country road and chatting to a local blacksmith when both men were ambushed and killed by British forces. A man called Douglas Duff served with British forces, particularly with quite a notorious or infamous division called the Black and Tans in the west of Ireland, before heading for Palestine as a recruit in the gendarmerie established on Winston Churchill's initiative. Douglas Duff was an overt racist who wrote about encountering what he called lesser breeds in the Middle East. Douglas Duff rose through the ranks of the British forces to become a police inspector for the Jerusalem area. Douglas Duff has been immortalised in the phrase "duffing up," a euphemism for violence and particularly for torture. His memoirs indicate that he may have been a pioneer of that horrible practice we now call waterboarding. The British were fully aware about the effects of their policies in Palestine. Some official reports acknowledged that colonization was leading to the mass eviction of Palestinians from land on which they lived and farmed. Despite acknowledging such problems, the British made them worse. During the 1930s, a major Palestinian rebellion broke out. Soon after that rebellion broke out, the British demolished the old city in Jaffa, leaving thousands of people homeless. That was one of many instances in which communities were penalised collectively for refusing to obey their oppressors. About 5,000 Palestinians were killed between 1936 and 1939. Relative to population size, that was a higher casualty rate than the casualty rates inflicted by Israel during the two uprisings or intifadas, which began in 1987 and the year 2000, respectively. State archives even refer to how Britain established a concentration camp near Sarafand al-Amar, a village on Palestine's coastal plain. And I hasten to add that it was the British themselves who referred to this facility as a concentration camp. The Sarafand camp was used for the mass imprisonment of people alleged to have taken part in the Palestinian revolt of the 1930s. As part of efforts to crush that revolt, Britain hired members of the Haganah, the largest Zionist militia of the time, and a forerunner of today's Israeli army. One British soldier, a man called Ord Wingate, brought Haganah commanders into the division that he led. Ord Wingate's division was called the Special Night Squads. As the name suggests, they were called the Special Night Squads because they operated mainly under the cover of darkness. Ord Wingate approved acts of extreme cruelty. His troops were known to round up all the male inhabitants, all the adult male inhabitants of villages next to an oil pipeline connecting Palestine and Iraq, ordering that these men strip and then whipping their naked torsos. Excuse me. The result of Britain's collaboration with the Haganah was that many of the Zionist forces who drove around 750,000 Palestinians from their homes the following decade had received British training. Britain had therefore prepared the groundwork for the Nakba, the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic, and this particular catastrophe was entirely man-made. Now, during the 1940s, Britain came to the conclusion that its mandate for Palestine could no longer be sustained. Yet, although the British were to relinquish the mandate in May 1948, they were still in charge of Palestine when the Nakba began. This means that the British were under a legal and moral obligation to protect Palestinians. that obligation was reneged on. For the most part, Britain took a hands-off approach as Zionist forces attacked and in some cases massacred Palestinians. Hugh Stockwell was a British military general stationed in the Haifa area, and his papers, which are available in King's College London, show that he knew in advance that Zionist forces were planning what he called a major offensive in that area. Hugh Stockwell ordered his troops not to intervene, but rather to let Zionist and Arab forces, in his words, fight it out. That order overlooked how Zionist forces were numerically stronger and equipped with much more lethal weaponry than the Arab forces. After refusing to help Palestinians, Hugh Stockwell told them to leave Haifa. Such instructions arguably made Britain a direct accomplice in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. It is true that relations between Britain and the Zionist movement have sometimes been tense. Two armed Zionist groups, the Irgun and the Lehi, came to regard Britain as a bitter enemy. These groups waged a campaign of guerrilla warfare, including a number of bombing offensives and some assassinations against British military and political figures in the 1940s. Despite being a strong supporter of Zionism, the aforementioned Winston Churchill came to lament how the ideology had, in his words, created gangsters. Britain has nonetheless continued to embrace the Zionist project. A number of British politicians have argued that they are duty-bound to support Israel, given that the Balfour Declaration led to that state's inception. Now, that does not mean that they necessarily romanticize Israel. On the contrary, successive British governments have tended to view Israel as a vehicle for advancing their interests, even to do their dirty work. That was dramatically the case in 1956, when Britain and France persuaded Israel to attack Egypt. That attack was launched because Britain and France felt that their interests in the region had been damaged by the Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser and his decision to nationalize the Suez Canal, which of course was located on a key shipping route between Europe and India. That offensive in 1956 involved Israeli massacres in Gaza. Those massacres have been documented by the United Nations, yet for some reason they are not even mentioned in a number of books that I have read about the Suez affair. They have, in effect, been airbrushed out of history by some historians. In June 1967, Israel went to war against its neighbours, including Egypt, once again. The military occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Gaza and the Golan Heights, which began that summer 50 years ago, persists to this very day. That occupation was enabled by the hundreds of battle tanks that Britain exported to Israel before June 1967. Those exports had the full authorization of Harold Wilson's government at the time. And after the June 1967 war, the British Embassy in Tel Aviv was pleased by feedback from Israeli generals about how the British battle tanks performed much better than had been expected. Israel has provided a bloody sense of continuity by basing its occupation on rules imposed by Britain when it was in charge of Palestine. Invoking such rules, it should be emphasized, does not in any way absolve Israel for its routine violations of international law. Britain's policies on the Middle East have been increasingly shaped by its key ally, the United States, in recent decades. Ronald Reagan set a pattern. Ronald Reagan resorted to the kind of duplicity that subsequent American presidents have followed. Ronald Reagan boosted military aid to Israel while portraying Palestinians as the obstacle to peace. His ideological soulmate, Margaret Thatcher, echoed him by branding all armed opposition to Israel as terrorism. Margaret Thatcher was the first British Prime Minister to undertake an official visit to Israel. During her stay, Thatcher gushed about how Israeli democracy was flourishing. Tony Blair has been even worse. Despite harping on about justice and statehood for the Palestinians, Tony Blair has proven to be a hardcore defender of Israeli aggression. Tony Blair entered Downing Street during a period when the Oslo Accords were still relatively fresh, if that is the correct term. Those accords followed an agenda driven by Israel and the United States that placed great emphasis on Israel's security. The Palestinian political leadership was required to become increasingly deferential towards the sensitivities of Israel. From the Blair era onwards, Britain has been one of the main contributors to United States and European Union-led security in inverted commas, operations in Palestine. The aim of these operations has been to train the Palestinian Authority's forces so that they can become a proxy for Israel. That is not simply my observation. Keith Dayton, the United States General, who served as a security coordinator in Palestine, noted how quite a few Israeli troops based in the West Bank left their usual posts to join Operation Cast Lead, the massive Israeli attack on Gaza in late 2008 and early 2009. The Israeli troops were willing to leave the West Bank for Gaza, according to Dayton, because they were confident that the Palestinian Authority's forces would take care of Israel's interests in the West Bank. the Palestinian Authority's forces did indeed take care of Israel's interests, they did so by attacking fellow Palestinians who came out on the streets of the West Bank to demonstrate solidarity with their brothers and sisters in Gaza. Largely unnoticed by the mainstream media, the bonds between Israel and Britain's arms industries have strengthened considerably in recent years. The largest military drone program in Europe is called Watchkeeper, and it has been commissioned by the British Army. Watchkeeper is worth more than £1 billion, and it is based entirely or almost entirely on Israeli-designed weapons. The Israeli weapons industry is involved in pretty much every stage of the program. As a result, there's a strong likelihood that the next time Britain goes to war, it will be doing so using weapons that have been tested out against men, women, and children in Gaza. The last time such weapons were used in vast quantities against Gaza was during the summer of 2014. The British government fully supported that offensive. Philip Hammond, who was Britain's foreign minister at the time, has noted that he and his colleagues took a bit of flack. That's colloquial term for they were criticised a little bit for their stance. But Philip Hammond added, "We are proud of that." Theresa May, the current Prime Minister, has similarly expressed pride in Britain's support for Israel. Just today, Theresa May welcomed her Israeli counterpart, Benjamin Netanyahu, to London, and probably now they are sitting down at a gala dinner to celebrate the centenary of the Balfour Declaration. Some of the recent comments from British politicians about Israel are truly nauseating. One British minister, a man called Michael Gove, has called Israel a truly miraculous nation and a light unto the world. Yet there is nothing miraculous about how Palestinians were dispossessed at the stroke of Arthur Balfour's pen. There is nothing miraculous about how Britain enabled the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And there is nothing miraculous about how a system of racial and religious discrimination was introduced by Britain and preserved by Israel. If British ministers are proud of their role in establishing Israel, then some very serious questions need to be asked. Does the British elite still think that it can trample, either directly or indirectly, on the rights of an entire people? If it does, then the British elite needs to be challenged at every available opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.